Hey, everybody, it's week 6, and we are going to be working on tying everything up on the rhetorical modes that we have been studying this semester, as well as some that we didn't write about, because I want to give you many tools for your writing tool chest. So you will only be quizzed over the ones that we actually did in class, for the most part, but I think it's good to have this awareness going into the quiz. So we're going to take a look at a bunch of rhetorical modes. So let me share here. All right, so as I mentioned, we're going to talk about hitting buttons. There we go. We're going to talk about a number of rhetorical modes or writing modes or modes of development, depending on what terminology you want to use for them. And on the left-hand side, of course, we have the ones that we used. Narration and description we used in the personal narrative. You wrote an exemplification paper, you wrote a comparison contrast paper, and you are currently working on cause and effect. So the others that I want to talk about with you and give you some definitions and some background on will be process analysis, which I have mentioned to you before, definition, which is something we use a lot in normal everyday life, classification and division, and argument. We talked a little bit about argument because cause and effect has some argumentative aspects as well. So first up, narration. This was the first paper you wrote, and it is the simplest definition, I think, of telling a story. Narration, of course, is based on events or things happening. They don't have to be real. We write narratives in film and TV and novels all the time, but they can be personal. But you can also use researched versions of stories to write about as well. And generally, when we write narration, we are doing so in chronological or time order. In terms of using it as part of academic writing, it is typically used as part of something larger. So, you did write a personal narrative for ENC1101, but you probably will not write another personal narrative other than perhaps its introductions and things of that nature. Description we used within the personal narrative, but the definition, of course, is to explore a person, place, or thing via sensory details. And it is important for our purposes that when we think of definition or think of description, that we do so based on sensory perceptions. What does it look like, sound like, etc. Just like narration, you may have your own personal observations in writing a description, but you can also research it. One of the common things we do in, say, art classes or humanities classes is to describe works of art. And typically we don't get to go see them in person, so we are relying on research to do that. Typically, descriptions are written in what we call space order. The best example of that is if you were describing a person, for example, typically you start with their face and work downward. Not always, depends on if they're wearing something weird, you may start with that. But for the most part, when we are using description, we are following a logical spatial order. Like narration as well, it is typically part of something larger when writing for academic purposes. I mentioned process analysis in an earlier lecture. Process analysis is a step-by-step analysis of a procedure. It can be done before something is done to show you how to do it, or it can be done after something is done to show you how it was done. The after one is we think of typically, or the main place we see that would be writing up a lab procedure, writing up a lab report of something that you did in a science class. For the flip side of that, the most common place we see those would be in getting directions to someplace or recipes, where you have a set of steps, and if you follow those steps, you will come out with whatever it is. It is a specialized form of narration because it is talking about events. It can be personal or researched. Tech writers, for example, even if it's not their particular field, will go and observe a procedure and then write out the steps for that. It is always written in chronological order, no exceptions. If you are doing a process analysis and you do it out of order, you are not going to end up with the correct item at the end or the outcome that you are looking for. We most often see process analysis, not necessarily in academic writing, although certainly science classes use it a lot. But where we see it more in general is in business or workplace applications. Technical writers write procedure manuals for all kinds of fields. Any kind of job, any kind of procedure that needs to be done somewhere, someone has probably written a process analysis of it so that people can follow those steps. Exemplification, I mentioned in that lecture that it is also sometimes called illustration. And that is when we are using specific examples to explore a general statement or idea. Those examples will be people, places, things, or stories. And of course, as with the others, you may do some of your own personal observation, or you may obtain your examples through research. Typically, in academic writing, the illustration is part of something larger. Typically, we're using it because we want to prove a larger idea, and therefore it's sometimes tied to definition, which we'll get to in a second. The next paper we did was compare contrast, which is exploring the similarities and differences of two subjects of similar class or genre. Talked about that before. These are always going to be based on traits or criteria that are specific to the subjects. So the criteria that you use to compare movies is going to be very different from the criteria that you use to compare political candidates, for example. Again, we may do our own personal observation. We may have our own knowledge, but more and more as we write for school, especially, comparison contrast is going to be based on research. And it is very, very common in college classes, sometimes not even necessarily for research papers, but for exam questions. That's a very common type of essay exam question that you'll see in a lot of different fields. Definition means exploring what a term means, simply put. It often uses other modes, especially if you're writing an extended definition. So you may narrate, you may use examples, you may talk about comparing it with something else. There are typically other modes involved with a definition if that is the overall type of paper that you are writing. And it is often, just like some of the others, used as part of a larger organizational scheme. For example, if I were writing a comparison contrast of two different psychological disorders, for example, I would probably start with definitions of what those are. So it's an interesting, it's kind of a circular thing. Definition might be the overall thing, or definition could be used as part of something larger. One that we didn't cover, which is pretty common, is classification and division. So what that means, of course, is exploring a subject by discussing how it can be classified with like items or divided into specific categories. So it's a good way of breaking a topic down or showing some kind of connection with other things. The danger is in stereotyping, especially if you're trying to classify or divide people. It is really easy to lump people together based on stereotypical things like race or gender or any of those kinds of things. It is, however, very commonly used in exploring concepts and in exploring large groups. Anytime you talk about like different genres of movies or music, for example, that's what you're doing. You're classifying and dividing them. One of the assignments that I've used when I have used this as a mode would be to look at, say, a large group like reality TV shows, and then divide that up into different categories within that larger thing. So romantic ones versus competition ones versus that sort of stuff. So It's a very commonly used one. Cause and effect, you are working on as we speak, which of course means exploring the reasons behind a phenomenon or the outcomes of a particular happening, and a particular event or a particular decision, that sort of stuff. It does involve convincing the audience of your take, which makes it pretty closely related to argument. And typically when we write a cause and effect, we are writing it in order of importance. I've mentioned before that usually when we're writing it in academic things, we're talking about either causes or effect. But there can be times when you are looking at both. Finally, argument. Argument is defined as persuading an audience of your claim, which means you have to be making a claim. A claim of fact, fact sounds like, oh, it has to be true, but a claim of fact is trying to prove something that is factual, but that people don't necessarily agree on. Climate change is probably the biggest one. Many scientists have had to write about the fact that climate change exists, and people still don't necessarily agree. A claim of value is whether something is good or bad, beautiful or ugly, that sort of stuff. So every time you read a movie review that's like, you should go get this, you go see this movie, that's a claim of value. A claim of policy is exactly what it sounds like. It's saying this should happen. We should eliminate whatever it is, carbon emissions, right? All cars should be electric. That would be a claim of policy. And we support those claims through three types of what we call appeals: logos, ethos, and pathos, or logical appeal, ethical appeal, and emotional appeal. Typically, when you write an argument, you want to rely most heavily on logic, but all arguments have some kind of ethical backdrop to them, and that's not always necessarily just a sense of right or wrong, but whether or not the author of the argument is trustworthy. And then emotional components, of course, are always a factor. Typically, where we mostly see argument in our normal everyday life is through advertising, and most of the support there is going to be more emotional than logical. We're always getting bombarded with ads for the next configuration of diamond necklace, especially around Christmas and Valentine's Day. And there's no real logic behind the fact that this configuration of diamond shows love, but the appeal there is the emotion behind it. So very, very common in academic and normal everyday life. So why do modes matter? Number one, it's important to know what the standard forms are. So when it's no different from knowing when you are writing a resume, where do you put your information? How do you set it up, right? So when we're writing papers or essays for classes, we need to know kind of what those standard forms are. So learning the writing modes will give you that knowledge, but it'll also help you make your own choices when you are developing your ideas. Sometimes your writing for college will involve your professor saying, write an argumentative paper about X, Y, or Z, or compare and contrast, blah, 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 blah. So sometimes those decisions are made for you. But other times you'll be told you need to write a paper for this class, and you will now have these different weapons for your writing arsenal. So that is an overview and a review of our writing modes. You will take a quiz on that this week. So enjoy. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.